On a freezing night in Chicago, a homeless man counted his last $8, planning to buy himself one small meal. But when he saw a tough biker stranded with no gas, he made a choice that would change his life forever. He handed over his last dollar, expecting nothing in return. But by morning, the sound of 300 motorcycles shook the street outside his shelter. What they did next left everyone speechless. On the freezing streets of Chicago, David shuffled along with his torn backpack slung over his shoulders, the weight of every step reminding him of the life he once had but had long since lost. He'd been homeless for nearly 3 years, ever since the factory where he worked shut down, leaving him with no job, no savings, and eventually no family. Tonight was no different from most nights. The wind bit through his thin jacket, his stomach ached from hunger, and his pockets held only 8 crumpled dollars. He thought about using the money to buy a sandwich and a cup of coffee at the nearby diner, something warm to fill him, a brief escape from the constant gnawing emptiness. He was just about to cross the street when he noticed a large motorcycle parked awkwardly at the side of a gas station. A man with a leather vest covered in patches knelt beside it, his face etched with frustration. His hands were covered in grease and small cuts, and his heavy boots scraped the ground as he tried to push the bike closer to the pump. The biker looked intimidating. Broad shoulders, tattoos crawling up his arms, and the unmistakable Hell's Angels insignia stitched across his back. Most people on the street gave him wide berth, turning their eyes away, unwilling to get involved with someone like him. But David stopped watching for a moment, sensing the desperation hidden beneath the man's rough appearance. The biker cursed under his breath, kicking the ground in anger when the machine refused to budge any further. David hesitated, then walked closer. "Looks like you're out of gas," he said softly, his voice carrying a mixture of timidity and sincerity. The biker looked up, his piercing eyes narrowing at the ragged figure in front of him. For a second, David thought the man might snap at him, tell him to get lost like so many others did. Instead, the biker sighed, his shoulders sagging. "Yeah," he muttered. "Ran it dry and my wallet's back at the clubhouse. Can't even make it home tonight." David looked down at the $8 in his hand, the same $8 he had been saving for his meal. His stomach growled loudly, reminding him of his need, yet something deeper stirred inside him. He knew too well what it felt like to be stranded, helpless, and ignored by the world. Without saying much, he stepped closer to the pump, pressed the bills into the biker's hand, and said, "Here, get yourself enough to ride home." The biker stared at the money as if it was some kind of trick. "Man, you can't even take care of yourself," he said, his voice gruff but tinged with disbelief. David just shrugged. "I know what it's like to be stuck. Tonight it's you. Maybe someday it'll be me again." The biker blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity of the act. No one had ever offered him kindness like that, without expecting something in return, and certainly not someone who looked like they had less than nothing. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. Finally, he gave a short nod, filled the bike with the few gallons the money bought, and looked back at David. "What's your name?" he asked. "David," came the reply, quiet but firm. "Well, David," the biker said, "you just did something no one's ever done for me before. I won't forget this." The sound of the motorcycle roared to life, echoing through the quiet night. The biker strapped on his helmet, gave David one last look, and rode off into the distance, leaving behind a swirl of smoke and the faint scent of gasoline. David stood there for a while, his hunger gnawing at him stronger than ever, but oddly, his heart felt lighter. He had nothing left in his pockets now, but he carried with him a strange sense of dignity. He had chosen compassion over survival, and though he didn't know it yet, the choice was about to change his life forever. That night, David returned to his usual spot near the homeless shelter, curling up beneath a thin blanket. His stomach twisted with emptiness, but he replayed the scene at the gas station in his mind. He thought about the biker's eyes, the way they had softened in surprise. For the first time in months, he felt like he wasn't invisible. The city around him kept moving, people rushing past as if he were nothing more than a shadow. But for that one brief moment, someone had seen him. That thought carried him to sleep, even as the bitter cold crept through his bones. As dawn broke, David stirred at the sound of engines in the distance. At first, he thought he was dreaming, the low rumble blending with his groggy mind. But then it grew louder, closer, until it shook the very ground beneath him. He pulled his blanket tighter and peered around the corner of the shelter. What he saw made his eyes widen in disbelief. Dozens of motorcycles, their chrome gleaming in the morning sun, lined the street. One by one they arrived, until nearly 300 bikers stood outside. The air was filled with the thunder of engines, the scent of exhaust, and the buzz of anticipation. David's heart pounded. He recognized the biker from last night at the front of the group, his leather vest unmistakable. The man swung off his motorcycle and walked toward David, his steps deliberate and steady. David froze, unsure of what was about to happen, but he could feel every pair of eyes on him. The biker stopped in front of him, pulled off his helmet and smiled faintly. "This is him," he told the crowd, his voice strong and commanding. "This is the man who gave me his last $8 when I had nothing. A man with nothing gave me everything." The crowd of bikers erupted into cheers, their voices echoing down the street. David stood speechless, his throat tight with emotion. He had no idea that one small act of kindness could ripple out so far, drawing hundreds of strangers to his doorstep. And as he looked around at the powerful machines, the leather jackets, and the sea of faces turned toward him with respect, he realized something he had never dared to believe. His life was no longer just his own. David stood frozen as the rumble of engines died down, leaving only the echo of cheers and clapping that seemed to bounce off the surrounding buildings. His breath caught in his throat, and he rubbed his eyes just to be sure he wasn't still dreaming. 300 bikers had filled the street outside the shelter, and every one of them looked at him not with scorn or pity, but with something he hadn't felt in years: respect. The biker from the night before stepped forward, a tall, broad man with a scar across his cheek and a weathered expression that somehow looked softened now. He extended his hand to David, and though David's fingers trembled, he reached out and grasped it. Their handshake was firm, filled with unspoken gratitude on both sides. The biker introduced himself as Jack, the road captain of his Hells Angels chapter. He explained how shocked he'd been that someone with nothing had given up his last $8 to help a stranger, especially someone like him, whom most people feared or avoided. "Brother," Jack said, his voice gravelly but sincere, "you reminded me last night that real strength isn't about the bike you ride or the money in your pocket. It's about the heart you carry." He pulled a paper bag from his saddlebag and pressed it into David's hands. Inside were 2 warm breakfast sandwiches, a bottle of orange juice, and an envelope. David blinked in surprise as he opened it, revealing several crisp bills tucked neatly inside. The crowd erupted in cheers again, the sound of boots stomping on the pavement, hands clapping, and engines revving in celebration. David felt overwhelmed. He hadn't held that much money in years, and for a moment he wondered if it was some cruel trick. But Jack leaned in and said, "This isn't charity, brother. This is us standing up for a man who deserves better. You gave me your last $1, and now we're here to make sure you don't feel alone anymore." David's throat tightened as he tried to speak, but no words came. Tears welled in his eyes as he looked around at the sea of leather jackets and patched vests, realizing these men, feared by many, had come to honor him. One by one, the bikers stepped forward, dropping off bags of groceries, blankets, and even new clothes at his feet. Some handed him small amounts of cash, while others offered to take him to get a hot shower and a proper haircut. David could hardly keep up with the outpouring of kindness. He had grown so used to being invisible, ignored, and stepped over on the streets that he barely knew how to react. His hands shook as he picked up a fresh coat someone had laid beside him, slipping it on to shield himself from the chill. It was heavy, warm, and it felt like the embrace of a family he didn't even know he had. The shelter workers came outside, stunned by the scene. For years, they had watched David shuffle in and out with nothing, scraping by on handouts and discarded food. But today, they saw him standing tall, surrounded by an army of roaring engines and loyalty. Jack raised his hand, quieting the crowd, and announced that they were going to rebuild David's life. "No man with that much heart deserves to be left out in the cold," he declared. The crowd roared in agreement, engines revving in unison, a thunderous promise that shook the very ground. David's knees buckled, and he nearly fell to the pavement, overwhelmed by the sheer weight of it all. Jack pulled him aside and told him something even more shocking. The chapter had pooled their resources together and found him a small apartment nearby. "It ain't much," Jack admitted with a grin, "but it's a roof, a bed, and a fresh start." "And it's yours, brother," David gasped, his hand flying to his mouth as tears streamed freely down his face. He had lived on park benches and in alleys for so long that the idea of having four walls and a key to call his own felt like an impossible dream. "Why?" he asked, his voice breaking. Jack clapped him on the shoulder. "Because you showed us what family really means. You gave without thinking of yourself. Now it's our turn." That night, David walked into his new apartment, escorted by a line of bikers who carried in food, furniture, and even a mattress. The room was modest, but to David it looked like a palace. He stood in the middle, staring at the clean walls and the small kitchen, overcome with gratitude. The bikers set everything down, cracked open beers, and filled the place with laughter and warmth. For the first time in years, David didn't feel like an outsider. He felt like he belonged. And as he sat down at his own table, with a hot meal in front of him, surrounded by men who had once been strangers, he realized that his life had truly changed. Word of the story spread quickly through the neighborhood and beyond. Locals whispered about the homeless man who had given away his last $8, only to have hundreds of bikers repay him with loyalty and love. The news even picked it up. Reporters capturing footage of the roaring motorcycles lining the street in front of the shelter, and interviews with David, who simply said, "I just did what I thought was right." His humility, combined with the sheer spectacle of the bikers' response, went viral online. Thousands of people across the country were moved, sending donations to help David get back on his feet. By the end of the week, David not only had an apartment, but also a job, thanks to one of the bikers who owned a repair shop. He traded in his ragged clothes for sturdy work boots and a uniform, his hands once again busy with honest labor. Each evening, he would sit in his new apartment, look around at what he had been given, and whisper a quiet thank you into the silence. That one act of kindness, born out of empathy and sacrifice, had rewritten his destiny. David had given away his last $8, but in return, he had gained something priceless, a family, a purpose, and the chance to live again.